Hello and welcome to Lost and Butchered RTD Routes, a series where we will look at the history of many different bus routes operated by Denver's Regional Transportation District. For routes that have since been discontinued, we will look at their entire history, from the very first departure to their very last arrival. For routes that still operate as of the modern day, we will look at their history from inception all the way up to their current iteration. We will discuss the many iterations between, why these iterations happened, and what is next for these routes. Note that certain routes like the 35 and 120X will not be covered in this series due to the fact that the routes have either seen little to no change between iterations, or in the 35's case, have since been returned to their original form from day one of that route's service. In this very first episode, we will take a look at Route 26X, the I25-Lone Express, which ran from Broadway Station to the Skyridge Medical Center via Arapahoe Village Center Station, at the time Arapahoe Park and Ride, and Park Meadows Mall. RTD's Route 26X, the I25-Lone Express bus, was introduced in January of 2004. However, this route would be short-lived, as it would be discontinued in the fall of 2006 with the opening of the Southeast Corridor light rail lines E, F, G, and H. As the E and F lines in particular would render Route 26X completely redundant, with exception to the stretch from Arapahoe at Village Center Station to the Skyridge Medical Center. However, RTD did not care about that last stretch of the route, and the whole thing was gone at the turn into the fall-winter 2006 run board, leaving Skyridge with no bus service for the next 13 years, until the Southeast Corridor would be further extended to its present terminus at Ridgegate Parkway, with Skyridge finally being included in the extension. As of right now, it is not currently known as to what buses the 26X was typically ran with, though judging by the fact that it was a highway route, it was most likely that the route used coaches, mainly the MCI D4500, like the coach seen here, except with a silver skirt, as that's what made up basically the entire MCI fleet back in 2006. But what did the alignment of the 26X look like? In its time, the 26X spanned roughly 16 miles from I-25 Broadway Station to Skyridge, mostly along I-25, with a few deviations to serve Arapahoe Park and Ride, Park Meadows Mall, and Skyridge at the southern terminus. Between Park Meadows and Skyridge, the 26X would not return to I-25. It would run on local roads the remainder of the way. The Skyridge stop for the 26X was located between Skyridge Medical Center and the site of the present-day Skyridge Station of the Southeast Corridor. As of the spring of 2006, the 26X ran mostly hourly on weekdays. However, it would have half-hourly frequencies during peak commute times. Unfortunately, weekend and Sunday holiday schedules were not obtainable for the same time period, nor were any other time period schedules obtainable. So this is the only snapshot I was able to find for the 26X schedule. Where did it go? In the fall of 2006, light rail service began on the then new Southeast Corridor line to Lincoln. Sadly, this meant the end of the line for the 26X, making it possibly one of the shortest-lived X routes in RTD's history. Every other X route that coexisted with the 26X was older than the 26X and kept going after the 26X was axed. Many of those other X routes, specifically numbered X routes, would keep going until the 2010s. In the mid-2010s, though, the majority of the express network was slaughtered, with the last remaining numbered X buses being the 116X, 120X, and 145X as of 2025. By the way, this is only counting those numbered X routes, as the lettered X routes, like the RX and EX, only picked up the X when RTD finally decided that they did not want any of the regional suburban express buses that were lettered to conflict with light rail nomenclature, as at this point in the 2010s, when a bunch of routes were redesignated, RTD had finally established that single letter designations were strictly reserved for the light rail. However, as we know, the Parker Pinery bus would not play by the rules and would hold on to its single-lettered P designation all the way until the summer of 2025, when the route was finally updated, being the present-day PD, which finally marked the end of single-letter designations for Suburban Express regional buses. Sky Ridge, now without bus service? Unfortunately, yes. Sky Ridge would not see another direct RTD service again until 2019 with the opening of the Ridgegate Parkway extension of the Southeast Corridor. So what's left? As of 2025, very little, other than maybe some tape hiding 26X symbols at Broadway and Arapahoe stations. The only other way to experience the 26X former alignment is in the form of bus shuttles on I-25 from Broadway to Sky Ridge Station. However, that almost never happens, at least not for such distances as that. However, Bustang does run a service that goes through Sky Ridge Station. That's the Bustang South Line. However, we don't normally get to use the South Line between any of the other stations in Denver and Sky Ridge Station. However, in the summer of 2024, that would change, as in the summer of 2024, with Phase 1 of Downtown Rail reconstruction, the E and H lines would have their frequencies reduced to once an hour. Because of this, RTD would end up partnering with Bustang to supplement this service because they knew this wasn't suitable. They knew what they were doing was bad. So they tried to make it less bad with the Bustang partnership, wherein Bustang would cross-honor RTD fares, and in fact, they even cross-honored the Zero Fare for Youth program, for any passengers traveling between any two stations within RTD's territory. And this meant you could take a bus to Sky Ridge. However, the partnership has since ended, and Bustang South has since gone back to its normal rules. However, if you knew that Sky Ridge was formerly the southern terminus of the 26X, then pretty much if you were riding the Bustang, once you got past Broadway Station, you were finally on the alignment of what used to be the 26X I25-Lone Tree Express. Now let's say the 26X was returned in 2025. What would it look like if it returned to service? Well, like it most likely was in its original iteration, the 26X would come back as a coach route more than likely. It would likely have mostly the same stops at Park Meadows and Arapahoe Station. However, the 26X probably would not terminate at I-25 and Broadway Station. As a matter of fact, it probably would no longer service I-25 and Broadway Station. The 26X could do one of two things. It could either go all the way up into the city, terminate at Union Station, or once it gets into the city, it could terminate at Civic Center Station. However, unfortunately, given the existence of the light rail lines, it's not likely that the 26X would come back. Though it's interesting to think about what could have been. And that just about does it for the history of the 26X, from its first departure to its last arrival, why it was discontinued, and what it would look like if it came back. In the next episode, we will be covering the first butchered route that still exists, Route 6, the 6th Avenue Community College of Aurora to Auraria campus bus. And we will talk about its original iteration, from Community College of Aurora all the way up North Pecos to 106th and Melody. And thank you for watching the very first episode of Lost and Butchered RTD Routes.